Welcome to the Henry George School Smart Talk program, where we speak with leading academics, activists, and other thoughtful persons about the many challenges we're facing in our societies. I'm Edward Dodson, a longtime member of the school's faculty. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Jeffrey Smith, a friend and colleague who has spent almost all of his adult years as an educator and activist engaged in the promotion of Henry George's solutions to our social and economic problems. As a young man, after graduating from California State University with a degree in linguistics, Jeff served as Director of Education at Basic Economic Education in San Diego, where he taught courses based on Henry George's system of political economy. In the 1980s, he became a co-founder of the member organization Common Ground USA, chapters of which continue to work in several regions for implementation of the taxation of land values. He is a co-founder and president of the Forum on Geonomics. Jeff's newsletter, The Geonomist, received the State of California's Green Light Award for raising environmental economic awareness. He is currently the editor of the Daily Progress Report, sent to subscribers in the United States and other countries. Jeff has always been politically active. He was a co-founder of the Green Party in San Diego, and his involvement in the party at both the state and national level resulted in getting the Greens to embrace the taxation of land values in its platform until new leadership moved the party to the left. And Jeff, that's the same thing that happened in New Jersey, where I live. Jeff is a charter member of US BIG, the organization working for a basic income guarantee to be funded by the public capture of economic rent. Jeff took the lead years ago, calling for a citizen's dividend coming from this societal fund of rent. We invited Jeff to join us on Smart Talk to talk about his 2019 book, Counting Bounty, in which he offers a unique perspective into the relevance of Henry George's analysis of our political economy and how the dominoes would begin to fall in the right direction if George's insights were embraced as public policy. So Jeff, welcome to Smart Talk.
Thank you very much, Ed. It was great to be here.
And first up, I'd like you to tell us when and how you first were introduced to Henry George's writings and how this led to the position you held with Basic Economic Education in San Diego.
Okay, I'm going to answer that. I'm going to add a little bit to my background. I think I've written the most cited Georgist academic paper ever, and it's over 25,000 citations. It's the one about funding mass transit with land value. And that's high for a social studies paper. Laboratory science, they get many more hits, but 25,000 is quite a bit for economics, history, things like that. And the other thing is, I was also a charter member of the Society for Ecological Economics, and you know some of those people. Gary Flo later got involved, and they were real sympathetic to our particular cause too. They seem to have drifted away from it like everybody else, but I think they'll come back. So what happened to me, I was living in Southern California and moved from Laguna Beach to San Diego, not that far apart. But when I updated my address for all the groups I belonged to, mainly Sierra Club, back then they had phone books. And in that section in the yellow pages was something called Land, Equality, and Freedom, LEAF, you might recall it. And I liked the name, didn't know anything about it. But I contacted them, and they were a Georgist group. I didn't know at the time, but they challenged normal ownership of land, and normal ownership of land can be very destructive. So I welcome that challenge.
Now, were you already thinking along those lines when you first came in contact with the people at Basic Economic Education?
I was really unhappy with both left and right. And I believed in markets, but I didn't believe in license, anything goes. And, you know, if that's your land, you get to pollute it or anything like that. And as an activist, you actually heard wealthy landowners and wealthy corporations say things like that. So yeah, I joined Leave and learned about George and learned about George's economics and was quite excited about it and just puzzled why it didn't catch on. I just kept thinking about that, thinking about that. And I think it's because, well, you look at progress and poverty, Henry George himself didn't mention taxation until page 406. And whenever you bring up taxes, you bring up tons of baggage and it obscures the whole picture. And people can no longer see land rent, or anything else you're talking about. It gets put into a different frame, the frame of taxes. That I think that's a stumbling block for us.
Well,
So that's when I got into it from the environmental movement. And this is so long ago, there were prominent Georgists who combined the environmental movement with the left. I remember being called a communist when I first joined the Georgists because I was an environmentalist. But any environmentalist worth his salt is neither left nor right and should be pro-market because the market is an organic social structure that operates much like the rest of an ecosystem. So yeah, some come around to that, but not a critical mass yet.
It takes a good deal of time spent with people who are thoughtful and not ideologically fixed in their thinking. It's my experience.
Yeah,
and there are plenty of people who are like that. The problem is that you run into many more who are not.
You're right about that.
Please do not confuse me with facts.
Yeah,
I have my belief system.
Exactly. Well, that's why Thomas Kuhn in Structure Scientific Revolutions said it's always the youth who bring about a paradigm shift because their minds, not every young person, but there's a lot more questing minds when we're that age. And but the thing is, a lot of people will agree, but they won't stick to it because any ideology needs to have popular support, some certain percentage. And we're nowhere near that, so people give us lip service and move on.
No, the facts are that what was once a fairly rigorous social movement has fallen into becoming a community of like-minded people.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do see that the message that Henry George was sending in his writings is starting to find an audience among younger people. And perhaps that's because they're feeling very pressed and stressed by the current economic and social situation. They're looking for answers different than they're getting from the left or the right, or in our mutual experience with the Greens.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be interested to know a little bit more about your experience with the Green Party in California and how the Greens dealt with, for example, the support for Prop 13 and that dramatic change in tax policy in California.
God, horrible. Okay, so I was a prominent environmental activist in San Diego, and Greens at that point, this is like what, 1980. There's just a couple dozen around the whole country, but one of them happened to be a San Diegan, a woman who was moving out of San Diego and wanted somebody to take her place, and so she contacted me, and I was already sympathetic to the notion of a Green Party, and told her that I would like to contribute green economics to the platform. And if that were the case, I'd be happy to organize. She said, yeah, sure. We don't even have an economics yet. So it'd be great. And so being a competent activist, I organized it. And the first meeting had like 100 people come. But it was really hard to get that initial group to be pure green in the sense of, well, we had rotating roles, we had gender balance, we had all kinds of idealistic practices, and most people couldn't adhere to them. And it got down to actually just me. It was reminded me of the Chinese revolution when Mao Zedong got down to like 9 people before he got up to hundreds of millions. And I thought I'd give it one more shot. And I tabled an event at the state college, and one guy joined, but he was the right guy. He saw it the way I saw it. He was dedicated. He wanted to adhere to the principles, and together we made it grow, and it became bigger than either the LA Greens or the San Francisco Greens, bigger than both of them combined. And the Green Party was so blown away that they made as a national pamphlet this essay I wrote about how to organize a Green Party. And it was a lot of fun, very successful, did a lot of fundraisers, adhered to the principles, not left nor right, rotated roles, gender balance, all the rest of it. And they had 4 pillars at the time.
Right.
Each one of them could match tax reform and subsidy reform along our lines. So the group I started, and Gary Flo was part of that, but then he left, and I was pretty much on my own. But I was really a believer, and so I stepped down because that you're supposed to rotate roles. And the people who took my place, they didn't step down when their turn ended. So that's politics for you. But they did leave the Georgist tax, and I would add subsidy planks in the platform. And we passed it at the state level. And then Greens are supposed to be not left or right, but pretty soon. In America, you can't say you're left. You can't say you're socialist. You can't say you're communist and have any chance of winning. So they infiltrate, not in a mean way, but so they'll infiltrate the Greens or infiltrate the feminists and whoever else and push their agenda. So they didn't understand the land tax. Nobody does really, very few do, and push it out of the platform and push me with it. So I thought that we could be more effective taking some other routes. I mean, I like Alana Hartzog, I also talked to Nader, Ralph Nader, and he agreed. He didn't do anything, but he agreed with us. So
well, that's sort of the common response. You talk to anyone who's reasonable in their thinking, and they see the merits. They see, but then they discount the political potential of adopting the reforms that are so essential. And it is very frustrating for those of us who have been activists in our lives. And it's one reason why I've pretty much withdrawn from the Green Party in New Jersey, because it's moved very much to the left in some of its policies I fully embrace, but in terms of economic policy, I think the Greens are missing a lot of what is important to everyday people.
Yeah, in the beginning, the Greens had a speechwriter for Nixon, and later one for Reagan. It truly was neither left nor right. It was balanced. It had strong market elements, strong libertarian elements, and the left got rid of all that. And they're not doing any better than any other leftist party.
Well, Jeff, you've added good context to your early, years and your thinking, the development of your thinking. So, I've known you now for a long time. We've been to many conferences together. We've had long conversations about what works and what doesn't work. We've both been involved in education and activism, and we've both embarked on trying to reach people by our writing. I have to say that you've been more successful than I have, but this latest book of yours that published in 2019, Counting Bounty. How did you come up with the idea? What has been the response so far in terms of public acceptance, or have you gotten some constructive criticism that's been valuable to you? What's happened?
Well, not a whole lot has happened. I really like the book. If for no other reason, it's got 1,000 footnotes. And if you ever wanted to see where this information comes from about the big picture, about real estate, corporations, banking, the environment, whatever, I mean, you can't go, it's like having a library in one book. And, but I wrote it, I tried to write it in the genre of popularizing science, not a polemic, not an argument, but just presenting some interesting facts that would get the reader to think. And I tried to be lighter and airier and non-academic and engaging and all that stuff. But it has not caught on. Another Georgist, Phil Anderson in Australia.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he wants to co-write another book and boil mine down to half of what it is, or maybe less, and be part of that book, which I'm happy to do. He hasn't been able to find the time to do it yet, but it's on his plate. And as you know, he's a stock trader. And
we've interviewed Phil on Smart Talk and discussed, his work, which continues, and I receive his updates regularly.
Yeah.
So he's spending all of his time with his team, really monitoring the global economy with a microscope and providing his subscribers with the unique insight into what's happening into the economic cycle.
Yeah.
And that's
really quite successful. And I'm really pleased he's one of us.
Well, there's the interesting enigma, and that is Phil is providing insight for people to profit by an understanding of the economy. How to translate that into the change in public policy that would allow all people to prosper is the real challenge. It's in part an intellectual challenge and in part a moral challenge.
Yeah. Well, the tax thing since the days of Henry George and for a couple decades after, I see it as a dead end. People just do not warm up to taxes. I mean, you can say tax billionaires and get a lot of agreement with that, but that's not Georgist in the least. So my tact and what led to writing the book was try to show people there is a surplus and it's due to society, so we should treat it as a commonwealth. The last part was just at the very end of the book. I just wanted to demonstrate the surplus first. And I used every official and academic source you could possibly find, everything from Lincoln Institute to the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis. And, it's really, really interesting what you find. I don't know if you knew this, but the BEA at one point said rent was like 2%. And they did this bait and switch thing. They defined rent close to how we define it. And then to measure it, they extrapolated from tax returns by landlords, which greatly, greatly, greatly diminished what rent would be. And you just have to wonder, why would the federal agency in charge of measuring the economy would pull a stunt like that? I mean, it's mind-boggling. And the newspapers don't write about it. And another one, just about every single piece of legislation has to have money behind it. And most of that money is rent of some form or another. Locally, it's usually land rent by developers and speculators. Nationally, it's usually bankers' rent influencing a domestic policy. and oil companies influencing foreign policy. So rent plays a huge role in politics. And there was a great book called Who Owns America by Dumhoff at University of California, Santa Cruz. And boy, you would have thought that would have just rocked the world, but no. And it was totally well researched. He gave every citation for every reference, and just mind-boggling that that kind of, even the left, our watchdogs, our complainers about the evils of the economy, evils of capitalism, don't touch this stuff. That's a huge blind spot on their part. And the ones from benefiting from it, they see it, but keep tight-lipped about it. And every now and then they'll pipe up, like that billionaire in San Francisco said he's paying his workers to pay landlords. Peter Thiel, remember that quote?
No, I don't know that.
Yeah, it's in my book. A lot of great stuff like that that just goes over people's heads. And one of the hugest facts from this research that's in the book that should blow people away, but does not. If you total all the natural rent, surface land and resources, and all the privilege rent, mainly monopoly, patent, excess
Competition limiting licenses.
Yeah. Well, did you know, according to even capitalist economists, 80% of the New York Stock Exchange value is patent rent? So anyway, if you add up privilege rent and actual rent together, it's greater than wages and what we call interest together in the GDP every year. And some see that. Now there's this one lady, I forget her name. She's with, what's that group in England? Starts with an A, Catholic worker. Was that it? No, that's America. What was the one in England? Oh, I can't think right now. But yeah, she'll write about that. She won't measure it, but she will say most fortunes are pure rent, which is nice to read.
But yeah, there was a book written in the 90s, and I don't remember the author off the top of my head. I think his name was Schwartz. It was something like the $30,000 solution.
Oh yeah, I knew that
guy. And he calculated that was the per capita rent from all the sources of rent that he could identify.
Yeah, it probably was at that time. It's up to like $50,000 a year now.
Well, I'm sure it is. I mean, just since the 90s. I mean, I often talk about, for example, in my professional life, when I started to work at Fannie Mae in 1984, the maximum loan limit for a single family property was about $85,000. By the time I retired in 2005, it had increased to over $400,000, and much higher in places like San Francisco or New York City or Washington, D.C., which were defined as high cost communities. So that just shows you, where the land price inflation occurred throughout that period of time. And that household incomes did not increase by that multiple. And in many cases, for people, it increased almost none at all.
You know what? At least when I was looking, had the highest land value of the cities. I mean, of course, as you mentioned, New York and San Francisco. Third place was Boston. And it shows you the power of public investment, zillions of universities there, and also shows you the power of density. You might know that they have, really small blocks and then interesting angled streets, and it makes the downtown both livable and high value. So, and what do they call it? Silicon something? What do they call Massachusetts?
The Golden Triangle, I think. Is that? No.
That's North Carolina. See, up here in the Northwest, it's called the Silicon Forest. And after Silicon Valley, south of San Francisco. But Massachusetts was Silicon something because of MIT and all the others. I can't think of what what it was now.
Oh, it's clear that wherever there's a high technology employment, land values have climbed to the highest in the nation.
Yeah.
And it's amazing when you read the stories about, people who have graduate degrees and cannot afford a home,
Yeah.
because the properties are so expensive.
Yeah. There was one article I came across where this guy in Silicon Valley, a tech worker, making well over $50,000 a year, $10,000 a month or whatever, living in his car.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the state of America today that we're attempting to try to, bring to light and get our fellow citizens to understand. And your work now, is focused on that with trying to promote the citizens' dividend
Yeah.
and the universal basic income.
Yeah.
I
I'm
I
not,
have
not doing the UBI. I'm just doing the citizens' dividend. But people who agree with me that rent should be the source, there's too few of us to support them. So they gravitate to the UBI camp and
yes.
kind of leave rent behind, which
I don't know. I wonder if you agree with me in my analysis. When I've written about the universal basic income and its potential, the one thing I keep writing about is that the universal basic income will fail unless we do something to increase the subsidization of the construction of affordable housing. That it was simply, you increase the disposable income of households at that level, and it will be capitalized into higher landlord charges for apartments and
yeah, you got
higher.
evidence from that in Alaska. I mean, they have the oil tax, but they don't have a surface land tax. So you can pair up the people getting the dividend and having to pay more for land. Even in Alaska, which huge expanse, not much concentration of population, but where there is, yeah, it pushes up the rents or selling price, either one. Yeah, we know that, and it's just frustrating. We can't get others to understand it. But it's why I switched focus from taxing to the surplus. I think taxes make people feel like they're sacrificing, but if once they actually see and feel there is a surplus, then they have hope for a healthier economy for everybody, prosperity for everybody. Remember the title of George's great work, Progress and Poverty? And I look out my window here. I'm going to try to show you before we end. There's a homeless encamped every single block. At the same time, there's all these new, big, beautiful buildings.
Yes.
Progress and poverty within the same block. And only you and I get it. And, others are going to hear this. And it's just mind boggling. I was lobbying.
There's a tent city around somewhere in every city of any size in the United States.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to see that on a trip to Canada, see the huge number of homeless in Vancouver. And then it was explained to me that the city fathers in Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal give the homeless a bus ticket to send them to Vancouver.
Yeah, that's funny.
Isn't that an interesting public policy?
Yeah.
Maybe it's an exaggeration, I'm sure, but also it's a lot easier for a Canadian to be homeless in Vancouver in the wintertime than it is to be in Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal.
Oh, that's very.
But we have the same sort of thing happening in the United States, where it's easier to be homeless in the South or the Southwest where it's warmer.
Yeah, but still there's not as much as where the government is more charitable. And, there's some parts of the country, people are not quite as tolerant of poor beggars. But the thing striking about Portland is that it's rapidly growing. It's rapidly getting wealthier at one end and rapidly getting poor at the other. I mean, it's just such a clear-cut illustration of what Henry George saw in his own time.
Yeah,
And
well, that had already been the case in 2007 when we had the last, systemic crash,
yeah,
where the concentration of income and wealth in 2007 had reached the same level that it had reached in 1929,
yeah,
and it's just hasn't stopped, getting worse ever since, regardless of who's in Congress or who's in the presidency.
for sure.
Um,
My newsletter you mentioned, the 2006 winter issue advised anybody reading it to consider that as the peak of the land price cycle. And I don't know if anybody took my advice, but yeah, you could have saved or made a lot of money if you had. But I'll be doing it again soon. I guess we all will. Just a couple more years.
Well, what about your commitment to education? Are you at all interested in getting back in the classroom?
Um, you know, if I end up spending more time in Portland, yeah. But it's really funny, Ed. Every place I ever lived and loved, I couldn't go back to once I left because places I like, everybody else ends up liking too. And they way push up the site values. Grew up there in Annapolis, Maryland, can't go back to there. Moved to California, can't go back to Santa Barbara, San Diego, San Francisco. Moved to the Northwest, can't go back to Seattle or Portland. So I don't know if I could come back here. I think people, hopefully a critical mass. And you really don't need that many for a critical mass. You don't need a majority or anything close to a majority. So with all this homelessness here and with the government actually doing nothing about it, and you see all the signs of vandalism, you walk down the street, there's so many boarded windows, so many folded local businesses, and it's just, tears at your heart if you understand the problem, understand the solution. So there might be some interest to teach. But when I went to the state capitol in Salem, and I guess you would call it community revenue lobbyist, he agreed, and he said, but the idea does not have legs.
Right.
In politics, you count noses. If you can't get it passed, why bother? So we really just have to get popular support. And like I say, need not be a majority, but if we could just show up with, a whole posse of people who agree, invite them to events with a good number of people, get some high level endorsements. And we had all that after the conference here. What was that, 98? And then the trustees for the movement funds pulled the plug on that. And that was that. I mean, you
Well,
can't go with other lobbyists and not be able to afford a microbrew afterwards. They look at you funny if you're poor. So that was that.
building a social movement is a challenge, and we have had the challenge of being an aging demographic.
Yeah.
And even, I know my own energy level has declined over the last number of years.
Yeah, me too.
It's not like it was when I was 30.
Nope.
I still have a fair amount of energy, as you do, and many others do, but there seems to be a generation or almost two generations between when you and I first became interested in Henry George's ideas
Yeah.
and took on the mission as our own, and the current generation where there's now greater frustration with the status quo than there ever has been. And hopefully the young people who've already gravitated to the ideas that we embrace will, I often describe what's happened in history in this way, that Henry George came along after Thomas Paine, and we'll talk about Paine in a second. that Paine carried this torch of liberty with all these remarkable insights and ideas. And he came very close to influencing the world and bringing about positive change. But he lost his stature because he wrote The Age of Reason and attacked organized religion. And that's a dangerous thing to do, as we know.
Especially.
So when he died, the torch of liberty fell to the ground, the embers nearly dying out. And then along came Henry George and picked up the torch and raised it high, and it burned bright again for a while. And with George's death, there was no one with the same charismatic personality and leadership to come along to succeed him. Right. Until, and I've talked about this recently, potentially Martin Luther King Jr. And the remarkable thing about King was that he was a friend of Walter Rybeck's.
Yeah, through his wife.
And Walt was able to slowly convince Martin Luther King that Henry George's solution to the problem of poverty was a solution that King might consider embracing. Sure. And so just as the opportunity for the torch to be raised again occurred, King is assassinated, is murdered. I don't know if it takes that kind of person who somehow has the same impact on the rest of the world as a Paine and George and a King or a Gandhi or someone like that needs to come along. But in the meantime, it seems like we have to continue to do what we do as best we can, and let's hope that the critical mass that you're talking about comes about.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I will note when King turned from politics to economics, that's when he got killed.
Yeah.
And then in Mexico, when Madero became president and taxed, the huge plantations, huge haciendas, that's when he got assassinated. When Kerensky was driven out of Russia, he was pushing the land tax too. In England, they actually had passed it, but they shelved it in order to go to war. And in Germany, it was actually in practice in a few towns. And the war wiped out all that progress. And I won't say that's what caused the war, but it seems rational to think that the landlord class, the nobility, really had this in mind too, when they did decide to go to war.
Well, they were certainly looking after their own interests, and looking for an opportunity to profit from instability. Yeah. And there's always the opportunity to profit during periods of instability, and those are willing to take advantage of the situation. Yeah. It just, unfortunately, twice in the 20th century escalated into a global war. I mean,
hey, did you
Francis,
pardon me? The bestseller recently, past couple of years, post-war.
I don't know that. I don't know that. The author?
It was a British guy who wrote it, and he just detailed all the destruction. It was much more than I had ever known. It was just amazing. And although he also detailed all the political movements before and after, it was, of course, he missed all our stuff. Because Georgism between wars had a renaissance in Eastern Europe that was defeated by a coalition of left and right, which is that's a striking fact in history that gets left out too.
Yeah, the leader of the German Boden reform movement, Adolf Hitler, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
He died, as I remember, in 1935, but as far as I've been able to find, of natural causes.
Yeah.
Although had he continued to agitate, he may have found himself
Yeah.
incarcerated and worse, from the
Yeah.
Nazis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Jeff, you and I have had the opportunity to work together a bit on the play that you've developed to try to bring Thomas Paine's legacy to life. There's a version of the play up on my School of Cooperative Individualism website and on my YouTube channel that we worked on together. And you've been working with a number of producers, actors, and others on promoting a new version of Thomas Paine Bones. Is that still the working title?
Yeah, I don't want to thank you for recording it, Ed, and I'll update you. I've been spending a lot of time in Mexico, more affordable. It's getting less affordable like every other place. A lot of gringos are coming down because of all the, well, first it was Trump, but now it's just a lot of different social failures up here. Man, everybody should take a tour of Portland. What was a pristine city is now just, kind of almost bombed out in places and deserted. Just amazing. So anyway, because I was spending a lot of time in Mexico, I wanted to see my work bear fruit in the town I was living in. And I had the best male actor in town, and I had a Mexican-American director, and I had a local theater, but I also had an enemy. I didn't know it, but this guy with a bad reputation, but he has a column in the biggest English language paper in the region, was really jealous of this project coming to fruition. And anyway, because of him, everybody else backed out because they didn't want to deal with him. And that kind of depressed me. But I have actors in New York, actors here in Portland, and actors in Boise, Idaho, who are really excited. The script has gone through a lot of refinement over the years. And so I think it's going to take place. I contacted the agent for Liam Neeson. I thought he'd be a great Paine. And that agent actually got back to me, but nothing's happened since. And I have to think of an excuse to bug him to push this forward. But if it can get on stage in New York, which is, Broadway, so there would be definitely a theater review and people would take notice, and that might get Liam Neeson over the edge. And once we get Paine out there, then we could get people interested in his ideas and maybe hopefully get George out there. But that's my strategy anyway.
Well, it's a strategy you and I share.
Yeah.
I mean, in addition to my involvement with the, Georgist community, I've been involved with the Thomas Paine community for not quite as long, but Thomas Paine was my intellectual hero from the time I've been a high school student.
Yeah.
And so one of the first serious books I ever read was Rights of Man.
Yeah.
And when you're 16 years old and you read Rights of Man, it really affects your thinking about what you're being taught as a young person.
Yeah.
And certainly, once I read Agrarian Justice some years later, it got me really thinking about what was wrong with the state of our society, which when I first read Henry George and Progress and Poverty, I said, immediately the light went off. This is Thomas Paine.
Yeah.
And, if Paine and George can become, household names.
Yeah.
I think Paine is more of a household name, but when you ask people, well, what do you know about Thomas Paine? You don't get much of an answer.
No.
Oh, he was a Revolutionary War hero, or he wrote Common Sense, and that's about it.
Yeah.
But but there is a rich community of people who I think are awakening to the importance of Paine, and almost by extension awakening to the importance of Henry George's contribution to intellectual thought and to moral principles.
Yeah.
So
Do you
for those
use-
reasons, we can be optimistic, and I hope that your play brings you great success, because if it brings you great success, that means it will mean that a much larger audience of people will begin to think more
Yeah.
deeply about what Paine has to say to them in his writings.
Yeah. Do you get Google alerts for anything?
Oh yeah, sure.
I get them for Tom Paine, and there's several every day. But I read about social change and try to persuade Georgists to be as smart about social change as they are about economics. I don't get anywhere there either. But
Well, you've tried to teach me, and I'm an old dog. I still try to learn new tricks when I can, but we each have our own styles, though. I think is what's the truth, Jeff. Even so many people are earnest, and we have our own styles and our own comfort zones. It's very difficult the older we get, I think, to move out of our comfort zone.
Oh yeah.
Although I have to say that the project that I undertook with you on Thomas Paine Bones took me pretty far out of my comfort zone.
Yeah, you did a great job with that. You really did.
That's my first acting job, Jeff.
You did great. One of the books I read about social change is it used an analogy of termites. And what termites do for fun is pick up a grain of sand and drop it back down. But when by accident they drop it on top of a previously dropped grain of sand, something clicks in their brains and they build an arch. And then something clicks and they build another. Anyway, they end up building a whole mound. So you can have all those grains of sand, but as long as they're scattered, which is what we are, we don't get any mounds. But once you get that critical mass of grains on top of each other, then you get these tall mounds. So it's just going to take a lot of, well, like Henry George said, 20 people pulling on the same rope or whatever it was, get more than 20 times the work done than a bunch of individuals going on different routes. So yeah, we have to cooperate in ways identified by scientists that actually succeed. And there aren't, like you say, every Georgist is a lone wolf. What we need is social Georgists, cooperative Georgists, like in your name of your group, cooperative individuals. So if it's the
I've always thought that cooperative individualism as a phrase or a term accurately described exactly the society and the social structure that Henry George was after.
Yeah.
And I didn't come up with the term on my own. I don't know. Do you know the history of cooperative individualism? It is the basis for the founding organizational structure of Fairhope, Alabama.
Oh, okay.
And I learned about it during one of the Henry George conferences, where the speaker was historian Paul Gaston. And he was talking about the origins of Fairhope. And he said, told us that it was built on the principles of cooperative individualism. And immediately it struck me as a more appropriate way to attract people than by using the name of an individual such as Henry George. And so when I established the School of Cooperative Individualism, I described Paine and George and others as architects of this philosophy.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm thinking in terms of the long term, because the movement for cooperative individualism has not blossomed as yet. I guess let me ask you, in terms of now where your experience of living outside of the United States and in Mexico, what is your sense of the attitude of people south of the border of the United States generally, and are, the challenges that they see us facing as well as the challenges they're facing economically and politically? Is there a sense of despair, or is there a sense of there's a possible way, out of the problems?
Um, you remember the dictator whose dictatorial rule led to the revolution, in which over 15% of Mexicans were killed? But anyway, he coined this expression, pity Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. Did you ever hear that one before?
No.
He was being funny. I do find it funny. But yeah, egotistically, there is some resentment, but practically, they're very grateful. They'd be a much worse off third world country if their biggest trading partner didn't exist next door to them. So that we're the reason they have a middle class. We're the reason they have an upper rich class. And they know it and they appreciate it. And the hothead males who point back to the 1848 war or 45 pretty much get ignored. And so, yeah, I've never felt the kind of animosity in Mexico that a Mexican would fear up here in America. Like, well, we bring them money and they take away our jobs, or at least in the mind of, uneducated people. So
It's
people hate to
definitely a
leave.
complex relationship under NAFTA, with many of what's the proper term, maquiladora?
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, as an environmentalist, I know there are concerns about the conditions in the communities that have grown up on the border, the
yeah,
absence of health, health and safety of good clean water and sewer systems and all of that, and plus the fact that the last article that I read that because of the high cost of land and the high cost of housing for workers, that their net pay, even though they get a higher gross income working in those factories than they would elsewhere in Mexico, after they pay the landlord, they're not in much better shape.
yeah.
Is that
True.
consistent with your understanding?
No, that's true. But one of the biggest sources of income in Mexico is America. The people sending back packets of pay,
Right.
and they're conscious of that. They don't want to see that come to an end. I went for a little jaunt into the countryside to see an eighth wonder of nature. It was a frozen waterfall. It wasn't really frozen, but the water was so rich in minerals, it looked like frozen water. It was pure white and smooth and beautiful and unbelievable. But when I got there, well, the road was so awful. A 20-minute ride was like 2 hours. I got to the village. It was nothing but huts, but on the roof of every single hut was a satellite dish.
Huh. How about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, blew me away. So no, they really relish having us as a neighbor and trading partner. And when something ugly happens, like what's his name, Trump, they just take it with a shrug. I think it hurt
As
me more than it hurt them that he separated those families at the border.
yeah.
And it hurts me more than it hurts that Biden has done nothing about it. So it goes. They're used to mistreatment, not just
As
by us.
Thomas Paine would say, Jeff, the times that tried men's souls never really ended.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is what our challenge is still, And
Yeah.
hopefully the work that you're doing and the work that many of the rest of us are doing together, that we'll be able to work more closely together as time goes on, and listen to some of the advice that you have to give to us based on your own experience and success. But hey, let me close out by saying that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. So for more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Edward Dodson, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.